If I were to ask you to sort these shapes into groups based on their similarities, how might you go about doing that? Likely, you would sort them into two groups, one for squares and one for circles. An easy task even a 5-year-old could do with little to no thought. But this same task was not so simple for a group of remote villagers living in the Soviet Union in the early 1930s. You see, at that time in the Soviet Union, an intense push toward modernity thrust many traditional farmers into a brand new and complex reality. These remote villagers, who previously had little reason to know anything more than what they needed to in order to survive, most didn't even know how to read, suddenly had to learn to cooperate with other farmers and systematize their process to meet assigned output quotas. This very intense period of rapid industrialization had a fascinating effect on the way that they viewed the world. Those who were affected early on by this period of modernization could sort those shapes just as easily as you and I could. But the most remote villagers, just on the edge of that wave of change, who hadn't quite yet been swept up in it, were incapable of doing so. One particular woman, interviewed by a curious young Russian psychologist named Alexander Luria, saw nothing alike in a square drawn with solid lines and the same exact square drawn with dotted lines. To her, the solid line square was obviously a map, and the dotted line square was a watch. Another remote villager insisted that filled and unfilled circles could not go together because one was a coin and the other a moon. Of the many lessons that can be learned from this unique and interesting example, an immediate takeaway for me is not only how much meaning shapes can carry, but also just how much the world around us and the way we view it can alter the way we perceive those very same shapes. And it's this revelation that has led me, as an aspiring artist, to look more deeply into what is known in the art and design world as shape language. Unlike those remote villagers, as people living in the modern world, we have no problem grasping abstract concepts like shapes. A big reason we are able to do so is our ability to see the big picture. When we see things like images, we tend to perceive the whole image, and not the individual parts that make up that image. To quote a popular book on the subject, pre-modern people missed the forest for the trees. Modern people missed the trees for the forest. And shape language allows artists to take this subconscious quirk of the modern mind and turn it into a tool to communicate specific thoughts and feelings through shapes. In fact, everywhere you look in art, from silhouette to lighting, details, composition, even the underlying structure, everything in art is communicated through shapes. Even the ability to break down and learn from reference is hinged on an artist's ability to see and simplify shapes and understand their relation to one another. And as a novice artist looking to improve my skills, it's become apparent to me that at the very least, understanding shape language is a necessary step in my journey. So now that I understand that, where exactly do I start? What are the fundamentals of shape language? What lies at its core? Well, across the myriad of articles and videos I've gone over in my attempt to develop a better understanding, there are 3 core shapes that consistently pop up. That is the square, the circle, and the triangle. Shapes we're all very familiar with, but what do these shapes communicate? Well, starting with the square, things commonly associated with it are toughness, strength, sturdiness, or stability. And things commonly associated with the circle are cuteness, softness, innocence, potential. And things commonly associated with the triangle are sharpness, danger, speed or movement. And to me personally, something that I've always closely associated with triangles is mystery. Think the Illuminati, the Bermuda Triangle, the Triforce, the Egyptian pyramids. And while I don't think it's always going to be important to consciously keep the meaning of these shapes in mind, it does seem important to have at least a general understanding of these core shapes in their meanings in order to use them effectively. If we look a little more closely, we can see that these basic shapes are made up of even simpler strokes. With straights, C-curves, and S-curves, you can make just about any shape. And even more importantly, you can use these strokes to combine core shapes to expand your shape vocabulary even further. And speaking of vocabulary, I found that looking at the parallels between shape language and written language has really helped me in my overall understanding as well as how to apply it in my studies. In written language, strokes make letters, which together make words and sentences that communicate meaning. Just like how in written language, you rarely see individual letters just chilling by themselves, but rather surrounded by other letters in whatever pattern the grammar dictates, in shape language, strokes make shapes. And shapes, when used together in a specific pattern, also communicate meaning. And continuing with those similarities to written language, the shape language of some art is simpler and easier to pick up on, whereas with other art, it's a bit more complex. This is especially true when studying from life, as the further you step away from more predictable structures like human anatomy and into more general things like nature and the world around us, there are of course still shapes, but the specific language or pattern can be more or less up to you to define. And now that I have a slightly better understanding of what shape language is and some of its applications, I think it might be a fun exercise to explore the existing shape design of my original character 𝗸𝘆 and see how it holds up. So I haven't actually drawn him in a while, but here on the left is an attempt at a slightly more realistic render that I abandoned in 2020, and on the right a more cel-shaded attempt from 2021. As it may be obvious to you, his primary shape language is triangles, with a secondary circular shape language. And in fact, thinking more deeply about core shapes has actually made it possible for the first time since the inception of this character for me to consistently draw his head shape, which prior to looking into shape language took me a lot of trial and error. But now it's as simple as drawing a basic circle just to get me started, and from there put up a center line and drawing what is really a rhombus, which of the core shapes I guess you could say is a square, but really if you break that down it's just two triangles. And I'd like to make sure that the bottom of this rhombus is resting along the bottom of the circle and extrude from the ends of that square outward, and then from there make two little triangles which come together to make his two smaller head spikes, and then from this corner of the square up to the center line at an angle that honestly is more intuitive, but from there it's basically done. And at the moment I'm taking kind of the same approach for his body. Circle, rhombus, triangles, and then I kind of round out the sharp edges on his body and on the bottom of his chin. And we'll talk a little bit more about why I do that in a second. So at first glance, his silhouette, with all of these sharp angles, especially with his cloak, gives kind of a dangerous vibe. But underneath that cloak, and looking at his design in its entirety inside of that silhouette, he's actually pretty cute and fairly innocent looking. And while I was not thinking about any of this when I made the character, I do think that this contributes greatly to his story, as it parallels his experience as the last of a very misunderstood species. Many across the galaxy hate and fear his people, and these sharp angles help to communicate how others view him at a distance, when truthfully, on the inside, he is meek and harmless. And also, the triangles communicate mystery, as to 𝗸𝘆, why people hate him and his people is a mystery, as is the reason for their extinction. And looking a little bit more closely at his face specifically, when I initially drew him, I intuitively rounded off the bottom of his face, which of course creates contrast with the top of his head, but also conveys a bit of flow or movement in a downwards direction. Really, if you look at his head as a whole, it's basically a big arrow. And remember that triangles on their own already communicate movement, but when combined with a circular C-curve, that movement can be greatly emphasized. And as of right now, there isn't much reason for this, but back in 2020, I did have the thought that maybe he could have a pendant or something holding his cloak together, maybe a relic or heirloom from his people. Of course, that face shape would draw attention to that. Or alternatively, seeing as he is mute and lacks a mouth, it might be kind of cool and creepy to have a mouth on his stomach, or maybe the indication of that mouth. And for a fun final exercise to help me retain more of what I learned, I attempted to redesign 𝗸𝘆's head, adding additional shape language into the overall design. So the core shape is still a triangle, but here I added more circular or ovular shape language, which gives him an even softer, cuter, even maybe more of a helpless appearance. And in this one, which I really like honestly, I added more rectangular shape language, although it may not seem like it initially given these sharp angles. That was a lot of fun. I still prefer his original design personally, but let me know which of the three is most appealing to you. And with that, I think that's enough of a study session for me today. I try to leave off on a fun note that will leave a good taste in my mouth and make me eager to study more the next time. And for good reason, as I'm going to need as much energy as I can muster for my next study subject.